My family loves our devices. Tablets and phones and cameras and toys. But with devices come wires. So many wires. Rats' nests of wires cluttering the counters constantly. We need a charging station. Go Gadget Woodworking. I started by milling down my boards. A couple years ago, I picked up a trunkload of sapele offcuts from a home manufacturer, and they're the perfect wood for this sort of project. I try to do all my milling at Lowell Makes, my local makerspace, because they have bigger tools and more room than I do in my basement. The device stands were the hardest part to mill because I was using scraps angled on both faces. But between the bandsaw and the jointer, I was able to get one side flat and square. Then I used a 1/2-inch straight cut bit on the router table to cut rabbets in the edges of the cover and baseboards.
I dry fit everything to make sure that the plan was coming together as I expected, and then gave all the pieces a preliminary sanding. I didn't feel like listening to my orbital sander, so I did it all by hand. Sometimes quiet is worth a little bit of effort.
Next, I cut all the holes in the side panels for the cables to run. An easy job for a Forstner bit. Drill some small pilot holes and then go halfway through from each face of the board so you don't blow out the backside with the bit. Glue up time. Clamping wasn't too bad. Just had to make sure the front and back boards didn't lean to the interior of the box and interfere with the top. While the base of the box dried, I turned my attention to the cover. I wasn't confident that the stands would be strong enough to hold the devices glued flat to the surface, so I cut dados. The spacing isn't uniform. I designed each slot to take a particular device. My kids' tablets, for example, have super thick cases that can stand up to being accidentally hurled at the ground at warp 7, so they need wider slots than my wife's dainty iPad. I cut the dados on my table saw with a dado stack. Because they're cutoffs, the stand boards aren't a uniform thickness, so each one took a few passes even with the stack.
Yes, I should make a less sketchy dado sled.
Glue up number 2. I ran boards over the tops of the stands to clamp them down rather than trying to secure each one individually. I only have so many clamps and so much patience. When everything was dry, I noticed that I had rather ugly gaps at the front of each stand board, which makes sense. They're angled, and if I did this again, I'd just mill them down flat on both faces because the angles don't help anything. I used the old wood glue and sawdust trick to make my own wood filler, which normally works really well on small cracks and holes. The problem is this time that I didn't actually have space in between the slots to sand effectively, so I couldn't remove all the glue staining. Well, correction. I could have removed it, but I didn't want to do the exhausting amount of hand sanding it would have required. I cleaned it up as best I could with some sandpaper glued to a flat stick and called it good. It's just for my family, and the stains will most likely be hidden by devices anyway. Still, in the future, I'd spend the time to do it right, because when you add finish, boy do those stains pop. I wasn't a fan of how the bottom and cover seams looked, so I added shadow lines.
For the top, I did this with sandpaper, chamfering the touching edges just a bit to obscure the seam.
For the base, I used the table saw to cut a shallow groove in that seam line, all the way around the box. Definitely made it look much better. Maybe in the future I'll do a contrasting inlay instead of a shadow line. Once everything was sanded, I blew it off, wiped it down with a tack cloth, and sprayed some shellac finish on it in the backyard so I didn't stink up my house with the fumes.
Always sand in between coats, and then rub down the final layer with a piece of brown paper bag to make everything smooth and pretty.
I added little rubber feet too, the ones I use on cutting boards. I actually hate these because they leave marks. Leave a comment if you have a good mark-free rubber foot that you use, because I need something new. Then it's time to put it all together. I bought a power supply with 6 USB charging ports, which I secured in place with a piece of double-sided tape. I wrapped all the cords I needed up with twist ties, plugged them into the power supply, and then fed them through the holes. Then I plugged the whole unit in, slid the devices into place, plugged those in, and basked in the glow of LCD screens and chaos contained. I wonder what kind of clutter we're going to keep on the counter now that the wires aren't there anymore. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the project. If you like this kind of build video, please drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss an upload.